Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or a tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on our favorite platform. Last week, the Torah taught us that only God owns the land, and we felt the liberation of not being tied to the land. This week, we see the flip side of not owning our land. We are exposed to exile and alienation, both physical and emotional, in very visceral terms. So pick up your walking stick and pack your bags as we become a driven leaf. So welcome everybody to Madlik, and every week I kind of feel, and I don't know if it's like that for everybody who reads the parsha every week, as if it's anew. But every Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, I look at the next parsha, and I'm always surprised by what I find. But it turns out that this parsha is an extension of last parsha, where we talked about the sabbatical year, and you're going to see that in a few minutes. And it really is the flip side of what we discussed last week. So if you're tuning into our podcast for the first time and you didn't listen to last week, after you listen to this one, I suggest you go back and listen to the flip side. But in any case, we are in Parashat Behalochtai, and it's in Leviticus 26, and it starts out, Im Bechukat Tai telchu, if you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments. And it goes on verse after verse how good things are going to be if you listen to God's commandments. But then we get to verse 13, and it says, I, God, am your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be their slaves no more, who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. But if you do not obey me and do not observe all of these commandments, if you reject my laws and spurn my rule, and of course the words that it uses is, if you don't listen to Bechukotai, and it says, and you break my covenants, then it starts talking about what will happen to you. And in a very poetic and haunting ways, it says, starting with verse 17, I will set my face against you. You shall be routed by your enemies. Your foes shall dominate you. You shall flee, though none pursues. And if for all that you do not obey me, I will go to discipline you sevenfold for your sins, and I will break your proud glory. I will make your skies like iron, and your earth like copper, so that your strength shall be spent to no purpose. Your land shall not yield its produce, nor shall the trees of the land yield their fruit. If you remain hostile towards me and refuse to obey me, I will go on smiting you sevenfold for your sins. And Rabbi, last week you you sensitized us to this sevenfoldness of the sabbatical cycle. And boy, oh boy, in this week's parsha, in verse 20, it says, I too will remain hostile to you. I in turn will smite you sevenfold for your sins. And then it goes on, when I break your staff of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in a single oven. They shall dole out your bread by weight, and though you eat, you shall not be satisfied. Va'achaltem velo teshvu. The opposite of what we do when we do birchat hamazon, where we eat and we are satisfied. And then in 28 it says, sevenfold for your sins. And it says, I will lay your cities in ruin, make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not savor your pleasant pleasing odors, exactly what we talk about in the temple when the sacrifices are given and God savors the pleasant odors. Here I will not savor your pleasant odors. And then in verse 33, and you I will scatter among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword against you. Your land shall become a desolation, and your cities a ruin. Then shall the land make up for its Sabbath years throughout the time that it is desolate, and you are in the land of your enemies. Then shall the land rest and make up for its 7 years. So clearly the Torah is not finished with the Sabbath cycle. The years of the 7 years lie fallow. Throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling upon it. As for those of you who survive, who will count faithfulness into their hearts in the land of their enemies, the sound of a driven leaf shall put them to flight. Fleeing as though from the sword, they shall fall through none pursues. This is an ongoing theme, that they will be afraid of something that is even not there. With no one pursuing, they shall stumble over one another as before the sword. You shall not be able to stand your ground before your enemies, but shall perish among the nations, and the land of your enemies shall consume you. And luckily, towards the end in verse 42, it says, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember my covenant with Isaac, also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. But oh boy, is this the flip side of not owning the land? And is this a continuation of this concept of 7, but this concept of the sabbatical year? And I have to say, we read the Torah every year, and it should be something new to us, but the continuation of the motif from last week was profound to me. What about you, Rabbi?
I think it's great. Well, there are a few things. Number one, of course, is that the number 7 is important, right? That's true just generally, the number 7. So everything is sevenfold. But there's no question. Last week's Torah reading was about the fact that if you observe the 7s, everything will be fine. So that when things unravel, they unravel in the same way or the opposite way of of the way it worked out. So if it worked out in 7s, it's going to unravel, right? And that's really what you read. You said, and it'll get the rest that it didn't get. If you don't observe the 7s, it'll unravel. It'll take advantage of that, and it will get the rest, and it will lay fallow, even when it's not supposed to lay fallow. So it's clearly a play on last week's Torah reading.
Yeah, it's a continuation. We always talk about the artificial division of one parsha to another, but this clearly is a continuation, and God, so to speak, hasn't finished speaking. And the flip side of being just an ezrach, just a settler, or a renter on the land, is that you definitely can, and we talked about it last week, that you can be discarded from the land. But what I am amazed by is the poetry, the haunting way that it describes what it's like to be in exile. And of course, for the biblical critics who claim that this parts of the Torah were written much later, that may have been written in exile, you can say, hey, I get it. This is written where people have experienced this. And for people that believe that the Torah is prophetic, how prophetic can you get? And this recurring theme of the neurosis, the psychology of being alienated from your land, where you feel you're being pursued and there is no pursuer there. That just blew me away.
So I would say, I would agree with what you said. And I would say it just a little differently. And that's what I would say is, wow, how psychological the Torah is, right? The worst fear is to feel like you're being pursued, but to have no
Mommy?
pursuer. Means it's one thing to be pursued, because if you're pursued, you know what? You know where to run away to. But if you just feel pursued all the time, that's really scary because there's no pursuer. I mean,
And
I always am struck. And what you said is also interesting. The poetry, this part of the Torah, is called the Tochacha, which is the warnings. And the tradition in synagogue is to read these verses in an undertone, which is really interesting. Um, and that is because it's symbolically to say, God, I hope you don't hear this, and you got to eat that up, right? God, I hope you don't hear this.
I understand that the Kutzker Rebbe, who was a survivor of the Holocaust and lost his whole family, and when they read these verses quietly, he clapped on the table and he said, "Say it loud. It's happened already."
You know that story from Rabbi Riskin, the same place I know that story from, the Kloisenberger Rebbe. But yeah, he lost his entire family, and he said, "Say it loud. We live this, and therefore we get to live the good things."
Well, if Madlik is anything, it's about clapping on the table and saying, "Listen to the verses." So here we are in Klosenberger fashion. So I named this episode "A Driven Leaf," and any American who grew up when I did read the book "The Driven Leaf," and I believe even Rabbi, you gave a podcast series on great American thinkers, and one of them,
the Rabbi,
yeah,
who you're connected to Park Avenue Synagogue. The Rabbi was the Rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue. He was one of the great rabbinic minds of the 20th century, Milton Steinberg, and he wrote an amazing book called "As a Driven Leaf."
So in the beginning of The Driven Leaf, it has a quote, and it brings the word driven leaf, the same word, ha'ala nadaf, but it doesn't quote our verse in Leviticus. It quotes Job. And Job 13:24, it says, "Why do you hide your face and treat me like an enemy? Will you harass a driven leaf? Will you pursue dried up straw?" So the fascinating thing is that in our text, we are kind of cursed with being a driven leaf. This is what will happen to you if you don't observe the commandments. And in Job, we turn that around and we say to God, "Will you pursue a driven leaf?" And that's the fascinating aspect of the verses that we've just read. On the one hand, they describe where the Jews will be if they don't listen to Behilchotai, to my commandments. And on the other hand, it so represents a very large portion of Jewish life where we were pursued by pursuers who weren't there, where we were a driven leaf. And there is this kind of dialectic, this conflict between looking at it as a curse and understanding it as this sympathetic understanding of what it is to be a nation who has suffered all these things. And that's why I focus on these amazing prose, this amazing insight that the text shows to the condition of the alienated person and the alienated people.
So I'll tell you something amazing. You mentioned the fact that, the Bible scholars say that this was written later. You see, you don't need to say that. Nachmanides Ramban, one of the famous medieval Spanish commentators on the Torah, he says the following thing. This poetry, the Tochacha, the warning, is actually mentioned twice in the Torah. Here, and then at the end of the Torah before the Jews enter the land of Israel. And the Ramban says that the 2 times are for the 2 different exiles. The first exile was after the destruction of the first temple, and the second exile is after the destruction of the second temple. So when you say that the Jews live this, or people in exile live this, the Ramban says the Torah is actually prophesizing about this reality, which really is an amazing thing, right? That this is what's going to happen. This very graphic description is really what happened to the people.
That means that we're kind of on the same page, and that is an ongoing theme that I've always had in our podcast, that whether you look at the Bible as, written by people and put together and the higher biblical criticism, or whether you look at it as a believing Jew, the ultimate outcome is the same, that either it predicts or it describes our people. And that is what we all, ultimately have ownership of. And that's what makes it, our book. And it belongs to our people in a very profound way.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and actually in this Tochacha section, you get that feeling more than in most parts of the Torah. I wonder, this is just an interesting thing to think about, why it is that these warnings are done in such a poetic manner. Most of the Torah isn't poetic like this. Why is this part of the Torah so poetic?
I think you can say it's poetic, and you can say it's emotional, and you can say it's empathetic, but I really feel that no matter what side you stand on, the author of these words, God, whoever, there's real empathy here, and there's real understanding here, and there's real sympathy, simpatico here. And it comes across, even from the beginning, when it says that I took you out of Egypt to be slaves no more, who break the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. Where have we seen those words written about the Jews coming out of Egypt? We made them free, we made them this, but it's an intro to what comes to follow, that I gave you freedom to walk erect, and then in exile you walk bowed. In exile, you were afraid of the shadows. In exile, you were a driven leaf. I think it's much more poetic than it describes the beauty of living in the land. It really has this connection to what it was like out of the land. And that is so, so powerful, both for a nation, but I think also for individuals who are alienated, for individuals who feel they are not belong. This is the power of this document, and I think this is why we are studying it till today.
That point is a great point, which is that the Torah is as relevant today as it ever was. And the reason we study it every single year is because every year it means something else. And we were talking before about the tragic shooting in the school in Texas. And, the answer is this is the week for the Tochacha. I'm sure many rabbis are going to say that, the idea of the warnings of all the bad things. And then we live a tragedy like this, and you wonder, this isn't what's described in the Torah, but you wonder that the Torah is warning us already about tragedies, about being careful about all of those things.
I said before when I picked on this concept of the driven leaf, how Job even took it in a different perspective, where the Bible, where we're reading it, looks at it as a punishment. Job flips it and says, would you go after a driven leaf? Would you persecute a driven leaf? So some of the verses here, it says in 26:19, and I will break your proud glory. I will make your skies like iron and your earth like copper. And I'd like for a second to focus on how that poetic metaphor has played out in Jewish history. I mean, or even in common Israeli nomenclature, which is one of my favorite go-to aspects of this podcast. Rashi talks about how you make your heaven as iron and your earth as copper, and he talks about the different characteristics of iron and copper. But, we all know about Iron Dome, the Kupat Barzel, which is the modern defense system for the state of Israel. And you gotta believe that it kind of comes from this. And again, it kind of flips it in a sense, saying that these words that were used for the uneasiness of the exile can also be turned around and protect it. I mean, my wife and I are now watching on HBO Plus an Israeli TV show that is called Kipat Barzel on HBO Plus. It's called The Commandments, and it uses the word kippah as a yarmulke, a kippah, and it talks about a brigade of the Cherudim who are in the army. But this taking of these words out of our parsha and manipulating them in different ways as both protective, as both, it's just fascinating to me, this concept of Kipat Barzel.
You love that phrase.
I do. And the other thing that comes to mind is we all know the beautiful song of Jerusalem of Gold. And,
right.
It became the mantra, the theme song of the Six-Day War. And there was a singer called Meir Ariel who was a soldier. And he actually saw his comrades die, and he actually saw the cost of that victory. And he wrote a song sung to the same tune as Jerusalem of Gold, called Jerusalem of Iron. And again, it was called Yerushalayim Shel Barzel, and it talked about the cloud of war. It talked about what it took to gain these pieces of land. And after all, what have we been talking about for the last 2 weeks? It's what land means. Are we owners of land? Are we owned by land? And in the notes for the show in Sefaria, you can see all the lyrics that he wrote. "O my Jerusalem of iron, O dark lead, can you not see? No wailing at your wall now, we set you free." It's very cynical. It's so much against the whole concept of you have a war, you publish an album. And I think there is this aspect here between the driven leaf that is in our parsha and the driven leaf that is in Job that kind of addresses this dialectic between what is a curse and what is who are we and what have we accomplished? I don't know. It's very fascinating to me how many of these words were taken.
Well, I mean, let's go back to Yerushalayim Shel Zahav for a second and Yerushalayim Shel Barzel. The fact that, again, it's the flip side. The very song, the very phrase that we use to describe the glory of Jerusalem is exactly the same phrase that he uses to describe the tragedy or the challenges. That's a very Jewish idea. And that's what we find in the Tochacha as compared to last week's parasha. The idea that the good and the bad are literally flip sides of one another, I think, is a very powerful idea. And I think that's a good. It's kind of a healthy way to look at things. If you're good, then X will happen, and if you're bad, then negative X will happen. But they're all related to one another. And I think that, to me, that's a very powerful idea in the Torah. And it's seen in this week's parasha more than anywhere else.
And I think ultimately the fact that the Torah invests this type of literary, poetic symbolism in the exile, at the one hand, yes, it is a curse, but at the other hand, there is this profound empathy and understanding. And I think that's ultimately what comes out of this. And, you look at this word, a driven leaf, which is just such a powerful metaphor. And you can't but think of the Yom Kippur Unatana Tokef, where it talks about we come from dust and return to dust. We labor by our lives for bread. We are like broken shards, like dry grass, like a withered flower, like a passing shadow and a vanishing cloud, like a breeze that passes, like dust that scatters, like a fleeting dream. But you are the King who lives eternal. And you can't but, the poetry of all of those metaphors could only be written by a people who was a passing shadow and who was like dust that scatters. And I think that comes out so profound that it almost transcends the curse.
That's interesting. So now, in the last 5 minutes, so we're changing the argument a little bit. And that is that the poetry actually kind of softens the blow.
It softens it, but it also, there's ownership there. There's only one God or only one author who could have written this. And that is a God and an author who is with us. That is a God or an author who loves us or who's a part of us. And that's why the punchline is so powerful, that it talks about, and I am the God of Yitzchak and Yaakov and Abraham, and the punchline is, and I will remember the land, and it's of your land. So, this is a people that was exiled from the land. When Yehuda Halevi wrote a book called the Kuzari, which was an argument for the superior nature of the Jewish people, the name that he gave the book was the Kuzari, in defense of the despised faith. You can say whatever you want about his arguments for how superior we are, but it comes from a place of being at the bottom of the pole, so to speak.
Yeah, there's no question that that's right. That's interesting about Kuzari. Means we're just at the bottom, and you can only appreciate all these things. It's people who lived and experienced and wrote about what it means to be on the bottom. And it really goes back to Rabbi Riskin and the Klosenberger, and that is, we know what it is to be on the bottom. But, we don't need to keep that a secret. We know what it is. We need to say that loud, because we've been on the bottom so much, we deserve now to be on the top. That's such a great Jewish idea, isn't it?
It is, and it's an idea for nations, but it's also an idea for individuals. And it's almost an implicit argument for saying, unless you really understand what it means to be a driven leaf, unless you understand what it means to be a cloud in passing, maybe you can't understand what it is to return to a land and to be privileged to have a land.
Well, that's the story of the state of Israel, and that is, we appreciate what the state of Israel is because we didn't have it for 2,000 years. Had we had it all along, it wouldn't have been such a big deal, right? But that was the celebration. And Sunday is Jerusalem Day. You talk about Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Yom Yerushalayim. It's the anniversary of the 6-Day War. And, we still remember that, and they still dance in the streets of Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day because it's still a celebration.
Well, absolutely. And it seems to me that in this argument, you understand the importance of being in the land, but you also understand and value that being out of the land and the experience that the Jewish people have out of the land. And, as I was thinking about this, Franz Rosenzweig was a great Jewish thinker. And he ultimately decided, he parted with his friend Gershon Sholem, who made Aliyah to Israel, because he believed that the natural state of the Jew was to be outside of the land, was to be a driven leaf, was to be a passing cloud. He wrote at one point, "It is only by keeping their ties to the diaspora that Zionists will be forced to keep their eyes on the goal, which is to remain nomads ever there." So this sense that we've had over these last weeks, where we look at the sabbatical cycle and we look at the fact that even when you're in the land, you're only a renter, not an owner. You're an alien. You're there by the grace of God. And that when you're outside of the land, you are this driven leaf, which is a curse, but also a amazing insight into what life is. That I think what Rosenzweig was saying, that you need both, and you need the tension between the both. And I think that's ultimately what the two bechukotai that we have in this week's Parsha really teaches us. If you listen to the bechukotai, and if you don't listen to the bechukotai, the lessons of being in the land, the lessons of being outside of the land, and that's ultimately what makes us so special.
I think that's a beautiful way to end. I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. You should enjoy this wonderful Shabbat and this in a sense, frightening Parsha. And we look forward to seeing you next week as we begin the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all for joining, and listen to our podcast and share it with your friends. Thank you so much.